A powerful Arab CEO mocked his maid's daughter in front of all his executives, but 3 words from the little girl were enough to bring the billionaire to his knees in tears. Just before we begin, your presence means a lot. Say hi and share where you're tuning in from, only if you want to. The conference room on the 47th floor of Al Rashid Tower smelled like Italian leather and fresh coffee, the kind that cost $42 a pound and was flown in weekly from a private estate in Colombia. 12 executives sat around a table made of black walnut imported from France, their suits worth more than most people's yearly salaries, their watches glinting under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers that hung from a ceiling painted to resemble the night sky over Dubai. At the head of this table sat Khalid al-Rashid, 36 years old, worth $14.7 billion according to last month's Forbes list, and known throughout Manhattan as the man who never smiled, never forgave, and never, ever forgot a slight. His dark eyes moved across the room like a hawk surveying prey, and when he spoke, even the air seemed to hold its breath. This was his kingdom, his empire built from nothing, and everyone in this room knew that their careers, their mortgages, their children's college funds, all of it depended on keeping this man satisfied. And right now, Khalid al-Rashid was not satisfied. The quarterly reports spread before him told a story of declining margins in the Southeast Asian market, a 3.2% drop that might seem insignificant to outsiders, but represented roughly $400 million in projected losses. Someone would pay for this. Someone always paid. Khalid's finger tapped against the polished wood, a rhythmic sound that made his CFO visibly sweat through his $3,000 shirt. The silence stretched for 47 seconds, each one feeling like an hour, before Khalid finally opened his mouth to deliver what everyone knew would be a devastating critique. But before he could speak, the heavy mahogany door creaked open. Every head turned, every breath stopped. No one interrupted Khalid al-Rashid's meetings. No one. The last person who had tried, a junior associate who burst in with urgent news about a merger, had been fired before he could finish his sentence and blacklisted from every major firm in the city. So when the door opened and a small figure slipped through, the executives didn't know whether to laugh or run. She was tiny, maybe 6 years old, with tangled dark hair that hadn't seen a proper brush in days, and a dress that was clearly second-hand, the faded blue fabric worn thin at the elbows and too short at the hem. Her shoes were scuffed white sneakers with a hole near the left toe, and she clutched a ragged stuffed bear that was missing one eye and most of its stuffing. She stood in the doorway like a ghost, her enormous brown eyes scanning the room, full of powerful men in expensive suits, searching for someone. Behind her, stumbling and horrified, came Fatima Hassan. Fatima had worked as a cleaning woman at Al Rashid Industries for 11 years. She was 43 years old, a widow who had lost her husband to cancer 4 years ago and had been raising her granddaughter alone ever since. Her daughter, Layla's mother, had died in childbirth, leaving Fatima as the only family the little girl had. Every day, Fatima arrived at 4:30 in the morning to clean the executive floors before anyone arrived. And every day, she left through the service entrance at the back of the building, invisible to the wealthy people whose trash she emptied and whose toilets she scrubbed. In 11 years, she had never once been seen by Khalid al-Rashid, never once crossed paths with the man whose name was on her paycheck. She was a ghost, just like all the other cleaning staff, existing in the margins of the corporate world. But today, everything had gone wrong. Layla's school had called at 7:45 to say there was a gas leak in the building, classes were cancelled, and someone needed to pick up the child immediately. Fatima had no one else to call, no family, no friends who weren't also working. Her neighbor, who usually watched Layla in emergencies, was in the hospital with a broken hip. So Fatima had done the unthinkable. She had brought her granddaughter to work, planning to hide her in the supply closet on the third floor for just a few hours until she could figure out a better solution. But Layla, curious and adventurous as all 6-year-olds are, had wandered off while Fatima was scrubbing a bathroom on the 46th floor. And somehow, impossibly, she had found her way to the one room in the entire building where she absolutely could not be. Fatima's face was the color of ash as she rushed into the conference room, her cleaning uniform still damp with chemicals, her hands raw and red from hot water and bleach. She grabbed Layla's arm with trembling fingers, her eyes refusing to meet anyone's gaze, least of all the cold, dark stare of the man at the head of the table. "I am so sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am so sorry." She wandered off. "It will never happen again. Please, I beg you, please." Layla looked up at her grandmother with confusion. She didn't understand why Nana was so scared. She didn't understand why all these important-looking people were staring at her like she had done something terrible. All she had done was get lost looking for the bathroom, and then she had heard voices through this door, and she thought maybe someone could help her find her way back to the closet where Nana had told her to wait. The silence in the room was suffocating. And then Khalid al-Rashid laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had just found something amusing in the most unexpected place, like finding a cockroach in a 5-star restaurant. He leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes moving from the trembling cleaning woman to the shabby little girl with the one-eyed teddy bear, and he laughed again, louder this time, inviting the room to join him. "Well, well," he said, his voice smooth as silk and sharp as a blade. "It seems we have a visitor. Tell me, little one, are you here to present the quarterly reports? Because I must say, you couldn't possibly do worse than the people currently sitting at this table." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the executives. They didn't want to laugh. Most of them had children of their own. But they also didn't want to be the one person in the room not laughing when Khalid al-Rashid found something funny. Self-preservation was a powerful instinct. And in this room, survival meant mirroring the boss. Khalid stood up from his chair, all 6 feet 2 inches of him, his custom-tailored suit worth more than Fatima made in 2 years. He walked around the table slowly, deliberately, his Italian shoes clicking against the marble floor, until he stood directly in front of Layla. He looked down at her with an expression that mixed amusement with contempt, like a cat that had cornered a particularly pathetic mouse. "Look at you," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look at this dress. What is this, Goodwill's finest? And these shoes?" He pointed at the hole near her toe. "I've seen homeless people with better footwear. And what is that?" He gestured at the ragged teddy bear. "That thing belongs in a garbage can, not in my conference room." Layla's lower lip trembled. She clutched Mr. Bear tighter to her chest, pressing him against her heart like a shield. Mr. Bear had been her mother's, the only thing she had left of the woman she had never known. Nana had told her that Mama used to hold Mr. Bear when she was scared, and now Layla did the same thing. Mr. Bear made her brave. Fatima fell to her knees. "Please, sir," she begged, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Please, she is just a child. She does not know any better. I will take her away immediately. Please, I need this job. She is all I have. Please." Khalid barely glanced at the woman on her knees. To him, she was furniture, part of the building's infrastructure, no more worthy of his attention than the elevator or the air conditioning system. His focus remained on the little girl, who was looking up at him with those enormous brown eyes that held no fear, only confusion and a strange, unsettling directness. "Your grandmother cleans toilets for a living," Khalid said, his voice dripping with disdain. "She scrubs the filth that people like me leave behind. That's her purpose in life. That's her value, and looking at you I can see that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You'll grow up to be just like her, won't you? Invisible, worthless, cleaning up after your betters until you're too old and broken to be useful anymore. Someone in the room inhaled sharply. Even for Khalid, this was cruel. But no one spoke up. No one ever did. Layla stared at the tall man with the cold eyes and the expensive clothes. She didn't understand all of his words, but she understood enough. He was being mean to Nana. He was making Nana cry. And Nana had told her once, when some kids at school had called her names, that mean people were usually just sad people who didn't know how to be happy. Layla had thought about that a lot. She had decided that if mean people were really just sad, then maybe they needed help being happy instead of being mean back. She thought about what Nana always said, the words that Nana whispered to her every night before bed, the same words that Nana said her own father used to say a long time ago when life was hard, but love was harder. Layla took a deep breath. She looked directly into Khalid al-Rashid's dark, cold eyes. And she spoke 3 words that would change everything. "Grandpa forgives you." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, like smoke, like the echo of a gunshot in an empty room. Khalid's face didn't change at first. His expression remained fixed in that mask of contempt and amusement, the expression he had perfected over decades of boardroom battles and corporate warfare. But something flickered behind his eyes, something ancient and buried and desperately, frantically trying to stay hidden. "What did you say?" His voice was barely a whisper. Layla tilted her head, the way children do when they're stating something obvious to a grown-up who should already know. "Grandpa forgives you. He told me to tell you, if I ever met you. He said you would know what it means." The color drained from Khalid al-Rashid's face. $14.7 billion couldn't buy back the blood that rushed away from his cheeks, couldn't purchase the suddenly unsteady beat of his heart, couldn't acquire the composure that was crumbling like a sandcastle before a wave. His hands, which had never trembled in front of investors or competitors or even federal prosecutors, began to shake. Who? He had to stop. He had to swallow. He had to try again. "Who is your grandfather?" Fatima was still on her knees, but now she was looking up with confusion and a dawning, terrible understanding. She had never told Layla about the connection. She had never spoken of it, not once in 6 years, because some wounds were too deep to touch, some memories too painful to share with a child. But somehow, impossibly, Layla knew. "His name was Hassan," Layla said simply. "Hassan al-Farsi. Nana says he was the kindest man in the whole world. She says he gave everything to help people who needed it, even when he had nothing left for himself." She hugged Mr. Bear tighter. "He died before I was born, but Nana says he visits her in her dreams sometimes, and last week he came to visit me too. He told me that one day I would meet a sad man in a tall tower, and I should tell him that Grandpa forgives him." She paused, looking at Khalid with innocent curiosity. "Are you the sad man?" Khalid al-Rashid's knees buckled. The most powerful CEO in New York, the man who had made grown men cry with a single word, the billionaire whose name was spoken with fear and reverence across 6 continents, collapsed to his knees in the middle of his own conference room, in front of his 12 most senior executives, brought down by 3 words from a 6-year-old girl in a threadbare dress. Because he knew that name. Oh God, he knew that name. Hassan al-Farsi, the man who had saved his life 30 years ago, when Khalid was just a starving boy in the slums of Cairo, abandoned by his father and left for dead by a world that didn't care about one more hungry child. Hassan had found him eating garbage behind a restaurant, had taken him in, fed him, clothed him, taught him to read and write and dream of something bigger than survival. Hassan had given him everything. And Khalid had repaid him by stealing his life savings, $10,000 that Hassan had spent 20 years accumulating, and fleeing to America to build his empire on a foundation of betrayal. He had never looked back. He had told himself it was necessary. He had convinced himself that Hassan was a fool for trusting him, that the money was wasted on a man with no ambition, that he deserved it more because he was willing to do what it took to succeed. He had buried the memory so deep that he had almost convinced himself it had never happened, but he had never forgotten Hassan's face. He had never stopped seeing it in his nightmares, in the quiet moments between meetings, in the reflection of his bathroom mirror at 3 in the morning when he couldn't sleep. And now Hassan's granddaughter was standing in front of him, and Hassan was speaking through her, reaching across death itself to deliver a message that Khalid had never expected, never hoped for, never dreamed he deserved. Forgiveness. "Sir?" One of the executives half rose from his chair, uncertain whether to call security or a doctor or possibly a priest. Khalid didn't hear him. He was looking at Layla, really looking at her for the first time, and he was seeing Hassan's eyes in her face, Hassan's gentle spirit in the way she clutched that battered teddy bear, Hassan's impossible, infuriating, beautiful capacity for love in the way she looked at him without judgment, without hatred, without anything but innocent concern for a sad man in a tall tower. "How?" His voice cracked. Tears were streaming down his face now, something that hadn't happened since he was 7 years old and his father left him on the streets of Cairo. How did he know? How did he know I would need to hear that? Layla shrugged, the universal gesture of children everywhere when adults ask questions that don't need complicated answers. "He said you were lost. He said you forgot where you came from. He said you forgot how to be happy." She took a small step forward, and with the fearless compassion that only children possess, she reached out and placed her tiny hand on Khalid's tear-streaked cheek. "Are you still lost?" Khalid al-Rashid, the man who had never answered to anyone, who had crushed competitors and destroyed careers with a single phone call, who had built an empire on the graves of his own humanity, looked into the eyes of a 6-year-old girl and told her the truth that he had never admitted to anyone, including himself. "Yes," he whispered, "I've been lost for 30 years. And if you're still with me, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. Now, let's continue the story." The conference room had emptied within minutes of Khalid's collapse. His personal assistant, a frighteningly efficient woman named Victoria, who had worked for him for 7 years, had cleared the executives out with nothing more than a look and a slight tilt of her head toward the door. She had seen many things in her time with Khalid al-Rashid, had witnessed firings that bordered on public executions and negotiations that resembled psychological warfare, but she had never seen anything like this. The man who prided himself on being made of stone was kneeling on a marble floor, crying in front of a cleaning woman and her granddaughter, and Victoria had decided that whatever was happening in this room was above her pay grade and best left unwitnessed. Now it was just the 3 of them, Khalid still on his knees, Fatima still trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion, and Layla, who had somehow found a chair far too big for her and was sitting with Mr. Bear in her lap, her legs swinging back and forth because they couldn't reach the floor. She was watching Khalid with the patient, curious attention that children give to injured animals, waiting to see if he would get better or need more help. Fatima found her voice first, though it came out rough and uncertain, the voice of a woman who had spent so many years being invisible that she had almost forgotten how to be heard. "Sir, I don't understand what is happening." She remained on the floor, unable to bring herself to rise, tradition and fear keeping her down even as her mind raced to make sense of the impossible scene before her. "My father-in-law passed away 8 years ago. He never said anything about knowing you." "How could he have known you? You are from a different world, a different life entirely." Khalid wiped his face with the back of his hand, leaving a wet streak across the skin that probably cost more to maintain than Fatima's monthly rent. He took a shuddering breath and pushed himself to his feet, though his legs still felt unsteady beneath him, like a man who had just stepped off a boat after years at sea. "A different world," he repeated, his voice hollow. "Yes, a different world that I built on his grave." He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Manhattan, the city spread out beneath him like a glittering tribute to his success. From up here, the people on the streets were nothing but specks, ants going about their meaningless lives while Khalid al-Rashid ruled from the clouds. He had stood at these windows 1,000 times before, feeling like a god, feeling like he had finally become something that couldn't be hurt, couldn't be touched, couldn't be dragged back down to the filth and hunger and desperation of his childhood. Now, the view just made him feel sick. 32 years ago, he said, not turning around, speaking to his own reflection in the glass, I was a boy named Khalid Hassan, not al-Rashid. That name I gave myself later, when I needed to sound more impressive for American business partners. I was 6 years old, the same age as your granddaughter, and I was living on the streets of Cairo. My father was a drunk who gambled away everything we had, and when my mother died of tuberculosis, he decided I was too much trouble to keep. He left me behind a dumpster near Tahrir Square, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a prayer that someone would find me before the rats did. Fatima's hand flew to her mouth. She had known her father-in-law was a charitable man, a man who gave what little he had to those who had even less, but she had never heard this story. Hassan had never spoken of it. I survived for 3 weeks on garbage and handouts, Khalid continued. I learned to steal, to lie, to become invisible when the police came looking for street children to throw in detention centers. I learned that the world was divided into 2 types of people, those who take and those who get taken from. I decided very early that I would be the first kind, no matter what it cost me. He turned from the window to face Fatima, and she saw that his eyes were red and swollen, his face a mask of pain that looked ancient and fresh all at once. And then I met Hassan al-Farsi. Layla perked up at the mention of her grandfather's name, but she didn't interrupt. Even at 6, she understood that this was an important story, the kind of story that grown-ups told when they needed to get something heavy off their chest. He found me behind a restaurant, eating scraps from a garbage bag. I was so thin you could count every rib through my skin. I had sores on my feet from walking without shoes. I was feral, more animal than child, and when he approached me, I tried to bite him. A ghost of a smile crossed Khalid's face. He just laughed. He said he had been bitten by worse, and he offered me his hand. Khalid's voice grew thick with emotion as he continued. He took me to his home. It was small, barely 2 rooms, but it was warm and clean, and it smelled like his wife's cooking. Your mother-in-law, Fatima. Do you remember her cooking? Fatima nodded, tears streaming down her face now. She made the best kushari in all of Cairo. Everyone said so. She did. She made it for me that first night, and I ate until I thought my stomach would burst. And Hassan sat across from me and watched me eat, and he didn't ask me any questions, didn't demand to know where I came from or what I had done. He just said, "You are safe here, little one. You are home." Khalid closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were focused on something far away, something that existed only in memory. I stayed with them for 3 years. Hassan taught me to read and write. He taught me mathematics, geography, history. He told me that knowledge was the only thing that no one could ever take from me, and he made sure I had enough of it to build a foundation for whatever life I chose. He worked 6 days a week as a tailor, earning barely enough to feed his own family, but he never made me feel like a burden. He never made me feel like I owed him anything. "Because you didn't," Fatima whispered. That was who he was. He gave because giving was its own reward. He told me once that God had blessed him with so much love that he had to share it, or his heart would overflow. I know, Khalid's voice broke on the words. I know that now. But then, all I could see was a man who had something I wanted. Something I needed, something that could help me escape the poverty that I feared more than death itself. He walked to the conference table and placed both hands flat on its surface, leaning forward like a man about to confess his sins to a priest. Hassan had saved $10,000 over 20 years of work. He kept it hidden in a coffee can, buried in the backyard, money he was saving to send his son, your husband Fatima, to university. It was his dream to see his family rise up from poverty, to give them the opportunities he never had. Fatima's face went pale. She knew what was coming. Some part of her had always suspected, had always wondered how a young boy from the streets had disappeared so suddenly and completely, but she had never let herself believe it. I stole it, Khalid said. Every penny. I waited until they were asleep. I dug up that coffee can and I ran. I made my way to Alexandria, bought passage on a cargo ship, and eventually landed in New York with nothing but stolen money and a determination to never be poor again. He looked at Fatima with eyes full of unbearable shame. I never looked back. I never sent word. I never checked to see what happened to the family that had saved my life. I told myself that I would pay them back someday when I was successful, when I had enough money that $10,000 wouldn't matter. But the days became weeks, the weeks became months, the months became years, and eventually I had convinced myself that the debt didn't exist, that the people I had wronged were just characters in a story that had happened to someone else. Layla had climbed down from her chair and was standing next to her grandmother, her small hand reaching out to hold Fatima's weathered one. She didn't fully understand what the man was saying, but she understood that it was making Nana cry, and she understood that sometimes adults needed to cry to feel better. My husband never went to university, Fatima said, her voice steady despite the tears. He became a taxi driver instead. He worked hard, and he was happy, and we built a good life together. But Hassan... She paused, struggling to continue. Hassan blamed himself. He never told anyone what had happened to the money, only that it was gone, and it was his fault. He worked himself to the bone trying to earn it back, trying to give his son the future he had promised. And when he couldn't, when his body gave out and he became too sick to work, he spent his final years consumed by guilt for a failure that was never his. Khalid made a sound that might have been a sob. I built $14 billion on the foundation of his broken dreams, he said. Everything I have, everything I am, started with that stolen money. And the worst part, the part that haunts me every single night, is that I knew. I knew what it would cost him. I knew, and I did it anyway. He looked at Layla, at this impossible child who had appeared in his conference room like an angel of reckoning, who had delivered a message from beyond the grave that he had never expected to receive. How can he forgive me? The question was barely a whisper. How can he possibly forgive what I did? Layla looked at him with those enormous brown eyes, eyes that held wisdom far beyond her 6 years, eyes that reminded Khalid so strongly of Hassan that it made his chest ache. Because that's what grandpas do, she said simply. They love you even when you make mistakes. They love you even when you forget to love them back. She paused, considering her next words with the seriousness of a child who has discovered an important truth. Grandpa said you were like a seed that got planted in the wrong garden. He said you grew up with thorns because that's all you knew. But thorns can be cut away, and underneath there's still a flower. He said he always knew you were a flower. Khalid dropped to his knees again, but this time it wasn't collapse, it was surrender. It was a man finally laying down the weapons he had carried for 30 years, finally letting go of the armor that had protected him and imprisoned him in equal measure. I'm sorry, he said, the words tearing out of him like something that had been buried too long. I'm so sorry. "I'm sorry, Hassan. I'm sorry for everything." Fatima found herself moving without conscious decision, crossing the space between them until she stood before the kneeling billionaire. This man had humiliated her granddaughter. This man had mocked her work, her life, her very existence. This man had stolen from the most important person in her husband's family and never looked back. But this man was also weeping like a child, broken open by 3 words from a 6-year-old girl, and in his face Fatima saw something she recognized. She saw the same lost, desperate hunger that she sometimes saw in the mirror. The hunger for connection, for forgiveness, for a chance to be something more than the sum of your worst mistakes. She reached out and placed her hand on his head, the way Hassan used to do when he was blessing someone. "I cannot speak for my father-in-law," she said quietly. "I cannot give you his forgiveness because it is not mine to give, but I can tell you what he would say if he were here." Khalid looked up at her, his face wet with tears, his eyes holding a desperate hope. He would say that every person has the capacity for goodness, no matter how far they have strayed. He would say that the past cannot be changed, but the future is always unwritten. He would say that the measure of a man is not the mistakes he makes, but what he does when he realizes he has made them. She took a deep breath. And he would say that a boy who steals to survive is not a thief. He is just a boy who was never taught that there was another way. Khalid's composure shattered completely. He buried his face in his hands and wept, 30 years of guilt and shame and denial pouring out of him in waves that shook his entire body. Fatima stood over him, her hand still on his head, offering a comfort she wasn't sure he deserved, but knew that Hassan would have wanted him to have. And Layla watched it all with the quiet understanding of a child who had just learned something important about grown-ups. That sometimes the most powerful people in the world are also the most broken. And sometimes the only thing that can heal them is a message of love from someone who should have every reason to hate them instead. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, and in the conference room on the 47th floor of Al Rashid Tower, something was changing. Something was beginning. The sad man in the tall tower was finally finding his way home, but this was only the beginning. Because forgiveness, as Fatima knew well, was not the end of a journey. It was the first step on a much longer road. The days that followed Khalid's breakdown were unlike anything the employees of Al Rashid Industries had ever witnessed. The CEO, who never missed a meeting, who was always the first to arrive and the last to leave, had disappeared behind closed doors. Victoria fielded calls from board members, investors and business partners, offering nothing but vague assurances that Mr. Al-Rashid was dealing with a personal matter and would return to regular operations soon. The rumors that spread through the 47 floors of the tower were varied and increasingly creative. Some said he had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Others whispered about a secret family emerging from his past. A few of the more imaginative employees speculated about witness protection programs and government investigations. The truth, had they known it, was both simpler and more complicated. Khalid had spent the first 2 days after the confrontation in his penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side, a 12,000-square-foot monument to success that he had filled with expensive art and designer furniture but had never managed to make feel like home. He had wandered from room to room like a ghost, replaying the scene in the conference room over and over in his mind, hearing Layla's voice, seeing Hassan's eyes in her face, feeling the weight of 30 years of denial finally crushing down on his chest. On the 3rd day, he had called Victoria and asked her to find out everything she could about Fatima Hassan. Address, work history, financial situation, family circumstances, everything. Victoria, who had learned long ago not to question her employer's requests, had delivered a comprehensive report within 6 hours. What Khalid read made him sick. Fatima lived in a two-bedroom apartment in a crumbling building in the South Bronx, a neighborhood plagued by crime, poverty, and landlords who collected rent but never fixed anything. She paid $875 a month for the privilege of living there, which was nearly half of her take-home pay from Al-Rashid Industries. Her husband had died 4 years ago, leaving behind medical bills that she was still paying off at a rate of $150 a month. Her daughter, Layla's mother, had died giving birth 6 years ago, leaving Fatima as the sole guardian of a child she could barely afford to feed. Layla attended a public school in the Bronx that had been cited multiple times for failing infrastructure and inadequate resources. She had missed 23 days of school in the past year due to illness, a number that correlated suspiciously with the dates when Fatima had been forced to work extra shifts and couldn't find childcare. Her medical records, which Victoria had obtained through methods Khalid didn't want to know about, showed a pattern of respiratory issues consistent with living in a building with mold problems and poor ventilation. And then there was the coffee can. Victoria had included a small note at the end of her report, a detail she had discovered while researching the family history. When Hassan Al-Farsi died 8 years ago, his widow had found a coffee can buried in the backyard of their small home in Cairo. Inside was a letter addressed to no one in particular, written in Hassan's careful hand. The letter read, "To whoever finds this, know that the money that was once here was taken by someone who needed it more than I did. I do not know where he is or what he has become, but I hope that he found what he was looking for. I hope that he built something good with what I could not give my own son. And I hope that one day when he is ready, he will remember that he was loved, because he still is. Because love does not keep accounts or demand repayment. It simply gives and trusts that the giving is enough." Khalid had read that letter 17 times. By the 5th reading, he had stopped being able to see the words through his tears. Now, on the 7th day after his collapse, he stood outside Fatima's apartment building, looking up at the cracked facade and the windows covered with plastic sheeting to keep out the cold. It was 9 o'clock in the morning, the time when Layla would normally be at school, but according to his information, today was a teacher development day, which meant the little girl would be home. He had considered calling ahead. He had considered sending Victoria as an intermediary. He had considered a dozen different approaches that would have allowed him to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. In the end, he had rejected them all. This was not a business negotiation or a hostile takeover. This was not something that could be handled through proxies and press releases. This was personal. And it needed to be done in person. He climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, his Italian shoes looking absurdly out of place on the stained and crumbling concrete. The hallway smelled like cooking grease and cleaning chemicals, a combination that reminded him with unexpected force of his childhood in Cairo. He found apartment 4C and stood before the door for a long moment, gathering his courage. Then he knocked. The door opened a crack, held in place by a chain that looked like it would snap with minimal force. Fatima's face appeared in the gap, her eyes widening with shock when she recognized the man standing in her hallway. "Mr. Al-Rashid," she whispered. "What are you? Why are you here?" "I need to speak with you," Khalid said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, uncertain in a way it hadn't been since he was a boy begging for scraps. "Please, if you will allow me." Fatima hesitated. Every instinct told her to close the door, to protect herself and her granddaughter from whatever this powerful man wanted. But something in his face, something broken and hopeful and desperately sincere, made her fingers move to unhook the chain. The apartment was small and sparse but clean. Fatima had clearly done her best with limited resources, arranging second-hand furniture to create a sense of warmth and home. The walls were decorated with photographs. Hassan and his wife on their wedding day, Fatima's husband as a young man, Layla at various ages, growing from infant to toddler to the 6-year-old who had brought a billionaire to his knees. Layla herself was sitting on a worn couch, Mr. Bear in her lap as always, watching cartoons on a television that was at least 15 years old. When she saw Khalid, her face lit up with recognition. "It's the sad man," she announced. "Nana, look, it's the sad man from the tall tower." Khalid felt something twist in his chest at the description. The sad man. Yes, that was exactly what he was. That was exactly what he had been for 30 years. "Layla, please go to your room for a little while," Fatima said. "The grown-ups need to talk." "But I want to see if he's still sad," Layla protested. "I want to know if Grandpa's message made him feel better." Khalid crouched down to Layla's level, meeting her eyes directly. "I am still a little sad," he admitted, "but your grandfather's message helped me very much. It helped me understand that I need to do something important, something I should have done a long time ago." Layla considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old philosopher. "What do you need to do?" "I need to fix a mistake," Khalid said. "A very big mistake that I made when I was younger, and I need your grandmother's help to do it." Layla nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Okay, but you should know that Nana is really good at fixing things. She fixed Mr. Bear's arm when it fell off, and she fixed the toilet when it made that scary noise. So whatever your mistake is, she can probably help." Despite everything, Khalid felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "I hope so," he said. "I really hope so." After Layla had been settled in her room with a coloring book and a promise of ice cream later, Khalid and Fatima sat across from each other at a small kitchen table that wobbled slightly on its uneven legs. Fatima had made tea, the cheap kind that came in boxes from the grocery store, but she had served it in cups that were clearly special, delicate china with a floral pattern that had been worn faded by years of use. "These were Hassan's mother's cups," she said, noticing Khalid's gaze. "They are the only things of value I have left. I keep them for important occasions." "I'm honored," Khalid said, and meant it. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened and everything that needed to be said hanging between them like a curtain. Finally, Khalid spoke. "I cannot undo what I did 30 years ago. I cannot give Hassan back the dreams I stole from him. I cannot return the years of guilt that he carried because of my betrayal. But I can do something now. I can try, in whatever small way, to make things right." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder which he placed on the table between them. "This is a trust fund," he said. $50 million, established in the name of Layla Hassan Al-Farsi. It will pay for her education, her medical care, her housing, everything she needs for the rest of her life. When she turns 25, she will have full access to the principal. Until then, you will serve as the trustee, with complete authority over how the money is used for her benefit. Fatima stared at the folder as if it might bite her. $50 million, she repeated, her voice hollow. "It is not enough," Khalid said. "It will never be enough, but it is a start." He pulled out another document. "This is the deed to an apartment on the Upper West Side. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a view of Central Park. It has been fully paid for, and the maintenance fees will be covered by a separate account for the next 50 years. There is a doorman, a gym, a rooftop garden. It is in one of the best school districts in the city." Fatima's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table to steady them. "And this," Khalid continued, producing a third document, "is a contract. It states that you are no longer an employee of Al-Rashid Industries. You are no longer a cleaning woman who comes in before dawn and leaves through the service entrance. You are now a consultant with a salary of $500,000 per year, and your only job responsibility is to tell me when I am being an arrogant fool." A sound escaped Fatima's lips, something between a laugh and a sob. "I do not understand," she said. "Why are you doing this? Why now, after all these years?" Khalid looked at her with eyes that held no pretense, no calculation, no corporate strategy. Just a man who had finally stopped running from his own shadow. "Because your granddaughter told me that Hassan forgives me," he said, "and the only way I can honor that forgiveness is by becoming someone worthy of it. The only way I can repay a debt that can never be repaid is by spending the rest of my life trying." He paused, gathering himself for what came next. "And because when I looked into Layla's eyes and saw Hassan looking back at me, I realized something that I had spent 30 years trying to forget. He didn't just save my life when he took me off the streets. He gave me a family. He made me his son, even though he didn't have to, even though I was nothing but a feral child who would have stolen from him without a second thought. And I threw that away. I threw him away, and I have been empty ever since." Tears were streaming down his face again, but he didn't try to hide them. "I cannot bring Hassan back. I cannot be the son he deserved. But I can be there for his granddaughter. I can make sure that Layla never knows the hunger and fear that I knew. I can make sure that she has every opportunity that Hassan wanted for his own children." He looked at Fatima with desperate sincerity. "Will you let me? Will you give me the chance to try?" Fatima was crying too now, silent tears rolling down her weathered cheeks. She thought of Hassan, of his kindness and his generosity, and his unshakable faith in the goodness of people, even when they gave him every reason to doubt. She thought of what he would say if he were sitting at this table, listening to the man who had betrayed him, begging for a chance at redemption. She knew exactly what he would say. "Hassan used to tell me that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die," she said quietly. "He said that forgiveness was not about excusing what someone had done. It was about refusing to let their actions define your own heart." She reached across the table and placed her hand over Khalid's. "I will not pretend that this is easy," she said. "I will not pretend that I do not feel anger when I think about what you took from us. But I also will not pretend that I cannot see the man you are trying to become. And I will not deny my granddaughter the chance to know her grandfather's legacy through the only person who can truly understand what he gave." She squeezed his hand. "You may try," she said, "and I will help you. Not because you deserve it, but because Hassan would have wanted me to, and because Layla deserves a future that is not defined by the mistakes of the past." Khalid let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." From the other room, they heard Layla's voice calling out, "Are you done talking yet?" "I want to show the sad man my drawings." Fatima smiled through her tears. "I think you have a young art critic waiting to meet you." Khalid wiped his face and straightened his shoulders. "Then I suppose I should go see what masterpieces she has created." He stood up from the table and walked toward Layla's room, toward the sound of her cheerful voice, toward a future he had never imagined and certainly didn't deserve. But maybe that was the point. Maybe grace was never about deserving. Maybe it was about receiving what you could never earn and spending the rest of your life trying to be worthy of the gift. Hassan had known that. Hassan had lived it. And now, 30 years too late, Khalid al-Rashid was finally beginning to understand. The news hit the business world like a Category 5 hurricane. Within 48 hours of Khalid's visit to Fatima's apartment, the story had leaked to the press in a carefully orchestrated release that Victoria had coordinated with military precision. The headlines were everything from sensational to skeptical. Billionaire CEO discovers shocking connection to employee's family. Al Rashid Industries founder announces major philanthropic initiative. The Cleaning Woman and the CEO, a story of forgiveness. What the press didn't know, what only Khalid and Fatima and Layla understood, was that the public story was just the surface of something much deeper. The $50 million trust fund and the apartment and the consulting contract were real, but they were just the beginning. They were the visible manifestation of an internal transformation that was still in its earliest stages. 3 weeks after their first meeting in the conference room, Khalid arrived at Fatima's new apartment on the Upper West Side for what had become a weekly dinner tradition. Layla opened the door before he could knock, having been watching for his arrival from the window that overlooked Central Park. "Mr. Khalid," she shouted, throwing her arms around his legs with the enthusiastic abandon that only 6-year-olds could muster. "You're late. Nana made lamb, and I helped with the rice, and I only spilled a little bit." Khalid found himself smiling, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his usually stern face into something almost warm. "I apologize for my tardiness, Miss Layla. I was held up by some very boring people who wanted to talk about very boring numbers." "Numbers are not boring," Layla informed him seriously. "My teacher says numbers are the language of the universe. Your teacher sounds like a very wise person." "She is. She's also teaching us about dinosaurs. Did you know that the T-Rex had tiny arms? I think that's very sad. How did it hug anyone?" Khalid considered this question with the gravity it deserved. Perhaps T-Rexes were not big on hugging. Perhaps they expressed affection in other ways. Like what? Like not eating each other, I imagine. Each. Layla giggled and dragged him by the hand into the apartment, which had been transformed over the past few weeks from an empty shell into a warm, lived-in home. Fatima had refused to let Khalid hire a decorator, insisting that she would make the space her own in her own way. The result was an eclectic mix of new furniture and cherished old possessions, family photographs on every surface, and the small touches that made a house feel like a home. Fatima emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron that read, "World's Greatest Nana," in glittery letters, a gift from Layla that she wore with obvious pride. "You spoil her," she said to Khalid, gesturing to the stack of books he had brought, all carefully selected to match Layla's current obsession with dinosaurs and space exploration. "That is my intention," Khalid replied. "I have 30 years of gift-giving to make up for." They sat down to dinner at a table that could actually seat 6 people without anyone bumping elbows, a luxury that still felt strange to Fatima after so many years in cramped apartments. Layla insisted on saying grace, a habit she had picked up from her new school, and she included in her prayer a request for God to help the T-Rexes find friends who would hug them even with their tiny arms. As they ate, Fatima shared news from her day. Her consulting role had evolved into something more substantial than either of them had originally imagined. She had spent the past 3 weeks touring Al Rashid Industries facilities, speaking with cleaning staff and maintenance workers and security guards, all the invisible people who kept the company running, but never appeared in annual reports or press releases. What she had found had disturbed her deeply. "The woman on the 32nd floor, Maria, she has been working for your company for 17 years, Fatima said. 17 years, and she still makes only $12.50 an hour. She has diabetes that she cannot afford to treat properly. She has 3 grandchildren she is raising because her daughter is in prison for drug possession. She works 60 hours a week and still cannot make ends meet." Khalid set down his fork, his appetite suddenly diminished. "And the man in the basement, Jerome, who maintains the heating and cooling systems. He has a degree in engineering from City College. Did you know that? He applied for a position in your facilities management department 3 times, and each time he was rejected without an interview." because the hiring managers assumed that someone who worked in the basement could not possibly be qualified for anything more. "I did not know that," Khalid said quietly. "Of course you did not know. How could you? You have spent 30 years in your tower, looking down at the world from 47 floors up. The people who clean your offices and cook your meals and guard your doors are invisible to you. They are invisible to everyone who has power in your company." She leaned forward, her eyes fierce with a passion that Khalid had not seen before. "You asked me to tell you when you are being an arrogant fool. This is me telling you. You cannot just write checks and think you have fixed things. You cannot just move one family into a nice apartment and declare that your debt is paid. The problem is not me, Khalid. The problem is the system. The problem is a world where a man like Jerome can have the same education as your executives, but be trapped in a basement because no one bothers to look past his uniform. The problem is that there are thousands of people like me in your company alone, working themselves to death for wages that keep them in poverty, and no one at the top has ever stopped to ask why." Khalid was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "You are right," he said. I have been thinking about forgiveness as a personal matter, as something between me and Hassan's memory. But the sins I am guilty of are not just personal, they are systemic. I built my empire on the exploitation of people like you, like Maria, like Jerome. I told myself that I was creating jobs, providing opportunities, lifting people up. But the truth is that I was just perpetuating the same cruel system that nearly destroyed me as a child. He looked at Fatima with new respect. "What would you have me do?" Fatima smiled, the smile of a woman who had been waiting for this question. "I would have you listen," she said. "Really listen. Not to your executives and your lawyers and your shareholders, but to the people at the bottom, the people who know where the real problems are because they live them every day. I would have you create a seat at your table for voices that have never been heard. And I would have you use your power not just to make yourself feel better about the past, but to build a future that is actually different." Layla, who had been quietly eating her lamb and only half listening to the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Grandpa says that the best way to fix a mistake is to help someone else not make the same one." Khalid and Fatima both turned to look at her. "When did Grandpa tell you that?" Fatima asked. Layla shrugged. "In my dream last night. He said that Mr. Khalid has a lot of fixing to do, but that's okay because he has a lot of help now." She smiled at Khalid. "He said you're not the sad man anymore. He said now you're the trying man." Khalid felt his eyes burn with tears that he no longer tried to hide. "The trying man," he repeated. "I suppose that is the best I can hope for." He turned back to Fatima. "Will you help me? Not just as a consultant, not just as a voice in my ear, but as a partner. Will you help me rebuild this company into something that Hassan would have been proud of?" Fatima reached across the table and took his hand, the same gesture she had made in her old apartment 3 weeks ago. "That is why I am here," she said. "That is why Layla is here. That is why Hassan sent his message through a 6-year-old girl to a man in a tall tower. Because he knew that you were ready to try, and he knew that you would need help." She squeezed his hand. "We are your help, Khalid. We are Hassan's gift to you. Now show us what you can do with it." And in that moment, sitting at a dinner table with a woman he had wronged and a child who carried his redemption in her innocent eyes, Khalid al-Rashid felt something he had not felt in 30 years. He felt hope. The real hope. The hope that came not from wealth or power or success, but from connection, from belonging, from the knowledge that he was no longer alone in his tower, no longer the sad man looking down at a world he could never truly join. He was part of something now, part of a family, however unconventional, part of a legacy, however complicated. part of a story that was still being written, one dinner at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of genuine trying at a time, and for the first time in his adult life, Khalid al-Rashid was not afraid of what tomorrow might bring. 6 months had passed since the day a 6-year-old girl in a threadbare dress brought a billionaire to his knees with 3 words. In that time, Al-Rashid Industries had undergone a transformation that business analysts were still struggling to explain and competitors were struggling to match. It started with the wages. Khalid had announced, to the shock of his board of directors and the delight of his 23,000 employees, that the minimum wage at all Al-Rashid facilities would be raised to $22 an hour, effective immediately. The cost to the company was substantial, roughly $400 million annually, but Khalid had pointed out that this represented less than 3% of their yearly profits and would likely be offset by reduced turnover and increased productivity. The board had protested. They had brought in consultants and accountants and lawyers who all explained in great detail why this was a terrible idea that would destroy shareholder value and set a dangerous precedent. Khalid had listened politely to each of them and then done it anyway. "I spent 30 years building this company by exploiting people who had no other options," he told the assembled board members. "I told myself that I was giving them opportunities, that they should be grateful for whatever I chose to pay them. But the truth is that I was using their desperation the same way my desperation was used when I was a child. The difference is that I had the luck to escape. Most of them never will, unless someone with power chooses to give them a chance." He had paused, looking around the room at the uncomfortable faces. "I am choosing to give them a chance. And if any of you have a problem with that, you are welcome to sell your shares and invest in a company whose values better align with your own." No one had sold their shares, partly because the stock price actually went up after the announcement, as younger consumers rallied to support a company that seemed to actually care about its workers. But mostly because they could all see something in Khalid's eyes that had never been there before. A certainty that went beyond profit margins and market projections, a conviction that could not be swayed by quarterly reports. The wages were just the beginning. Next came the Education Fund, a $100 million initiative to provide scholarships and job training for employees and their families. Then the healthcare expansion, which guaranteed comprehensive coverage for all workers regardless of their position or hours. Then the housing assistance program, the childcare subsidies, the promotion pathway that ensured people like Jerome the engineer would never again be trapped in roles beneath their capabilities. Each initiative faced resistance. Each one required Khalid to spend political capital he had accumulated over decades, to cash in favors, to make enemies of people who had once been allies. But each time he wavered, each time the old voices in his head told him that he was being foolish, that he was weakening his position, that he was betraying everything he had built, he would think of Layla's eyes and Hassan's letter and Fatima's fierce, uncompromising vision of what justice actually looked like. And he would keep going. The real test came in April, 7 months after the conference room revelation, when a fire broke out in one of Al-Rashid Industries' manufacturing facilities in Bangladesh. The building was old, the safety systems inadequate, and 17 workers were killed before the flames could be contained. It was the kind of tragedy that happened regularly in developing countries, the kind that usually resulted in a brief flurry of bad press, followed by a quiet settlement and a return to business as usual. Khalid flew to Bangladesh personally. He met with the families of the victims, sitting in their homes, drinking their tea, listening to their stories of the people they had lost. He visited the survivors in the hospital, some of whom would carry scars for the rest of their lives. He toured the burned-out factory and saw for himself the conditions that had made the tragedy possible. The locked emergency exits, the absent fire extinguishers, the crowded workstations that turned a manageable fire into a death trap. And then he called a press conference. Standing in front of cameras from every major news network in the world, Khalid al-Rashid did something that no CEO of a major corporation had ever done before. He took full, personal responsibility for the deaths. "These 17 people died because of decisions that were made in my name," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. "They died because I prioritized profit over safety, because I allowed a culture to develop in my company where cutting corners was rewarded and raising concerns was punished. Because I was too focused on the numbers in my quarterly reports to remember that behind every number is a human being with a family and dreams and a right to come home safe at the end of their shift." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "I cannot bring these people back. I cannot undo the suffering that my negligence has caused, but I can make sure that it never happens again. Effective immediately, I'm shutting down all manufacturing operations in facilities that do not meet the highest international safety standards. I'm committing $500 million to upgrading every factory, warehouse, and office building that bears my company's name. And I am establishing a victims fund that will provide lifetime support for the families of those who died and those who were injured, not because any amount of money can compensate for their loss, but because it is the least I can do." He took a breath. "Some of my advisors have told me that this is a mistake. They have told me that admitting fault opens the company to liability, that I should let the lawyers handle it, that I should protect the shareholders' interests first. But I have spent 30 years protecting shareholders' interests, and it has cost me my soul. It is time to start protecting something more important. It is time to start protecting the people who make this company possible." The fallout was immediate and intense. Lawsuits multiplied, stock prices dropped, several major investors announced they were divesting, business commentators questioned Khalid's sanity and speculated about secret health problems or impending retirement. But something else happened too. Something unexpected. People started applying to work at Al-Rashid Industries in record numbers. Talented people, creative people, people who had options and chose to work for a company that seemed to actually mean what it said about valuing human beings. Consumer surveys showed a massive spike in brand loyalty, particularly among younger demographics who had grown up distrustful of corporate promises. Employee morale, which had always been mediocre at best, soared to unprecedented levels. And the stock price, after an initial drop of 15%, began to climb. Slowly at first, then more rapidly, until by the end of the year it had exceeded its previous high by 12%. Fatima watched all of this from her position as Khalid's unofficial conscience and official advisor. She attended board meetings now, sitting at the same table where Layla had first appeared, offering perspectives that no one in that room had ever considered before. She pushed back when she thought Khalid was moving too slowly or settling for half measures. She celebrated when she saw genuine change happening, when workers who had been invisible for years were suddenly being seen and heard and valued. And every week, without fail, Khalid came to dinner. He came on days when everything was going well, and days when everything seemed to be falling apart. He came when he was exhausted, and when he was energized, and when he was so overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had undertaken that he could barely speak. He came because the apartment on the Upper West Side had become the closest thing to a home he had ever known, because Fatima's cooking reminded him of meals he had eaten 30 years ago in a small house in Cairo, because Layla's hugs and questions and endless stories about dinosaurs and school friends had become the anchor that kept him grounded when the storms of the business world threatened to sweep him away. One evening, about 8 months after the conference room encounter, Layla asked him a question that stopped him in his tracks. "Mr. Khalid," she said, with the earnest seriousness that she brought to all important matters, "are you still trying to fix your mistake?" He set down his fork and looked at her, at this remarkable child who had somehow become the center of his universe, without either of them planning it. "Yes," he said, "I am still trying." "Do you think you'll ever be done?" Khalid considered the question carefully. "I don't think so," he admitted. "I think the fixing might take the rest of my life, but I don't mind, because now I have people to help me, and because the fixing is actually making me happy in a way that all the money and success never did." Layla nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer. Then she grinned. "Grandpa says that's good," she announced. "He says you're getting better at listening. He says pretty soon you might even be as smart as a 6-year-old. Khalid laughed, a real laugh that echoed through the apartment and made Fatima smile in the kitchen where she was preparing dessert. "Your grandfather always did have high expectations," he said. "He says high expectations are how people become their best selves," Layla replied primly. "He also says I should ask you if you want to come to my school play next month. I'm playing a tree. It's a very important part, because trees give us oxygen, and without oxygen everyone would die." "I would be honored to attend your play," Khalid said. "I cannot think of anyone I would rather see play a tree." Layla beamed. "Nana says you're practically family now. Is that true?" Khalid looked at the little girl with her grandfather's eyes and her grandmother's fierce spirit, and he felt something expand in his chest, something warm and bright and terrifying in its intensity. "Yes," he said, "I think that is true." And in that moment, sitting at a dinner table in an apartment that had become his sanctuary, surrounded by the family he had found through the strangest and most painful of circumstances, Khalid al-Rashid understood something that $14.7 billion had never been able to teach him. He understood what it meant to belong. The anniversary came faster than any of them expected. 1 year since a lost little girl wandered into a conference room and changed everything with 3 words. 1 year since a billionaire discovered that all his wealth and power meant nothing compared to the message of a man he had betrayed 30 years ago. Khalid marked the occasion not with a press release or a corporate event, but with a quiet trip to Cairo. He had not been back to Egypt since he fled as a 9-year-old with stolen money in his pocket and guilt beginning its slow corruption of his soul. The city had changed enormously in 30 years, modernizing and expanding and erasing many of the landmarks he remembered from his childhood on the streets, but some things remained the same. The way the Nile glinted in the afternoon sun, the call to prayer echoing from 1,000 minarets, the smell of spices and exhaust and something indefinably Egyptian that hit him the moment he stepped off the plane. He had brought Fatima and Layla with him. It had seemed right, somehow, that they should be there when he finally closed the circle that had begun so many years ago. They visited Hassan's grave first. It was in a small cemetery on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a low wall of crumbling brick and shaded by date palms that had been planted decades ago and had grown tall in the intervening years. Hassan's headstone was simple, just his name and dates and a verse from the Quran about the rewards that await those who give without expectation of return. Khalid stood before the grave for a long time, not speaking, not praying, just being present with the man who had saved him and whom he had betrayed. "I do not know if you can hear me," he finally said, his voice rough. "I do not know if any of this matters to you now, wherever you are. But I need to say it anyway. I need to tell you that I understand now what you were trying to teach me. It was not about the money. It was never about the money. It was about seeing the person in front of you, really seeing them, and choosing to help, even when it costs you something. It was about believing that everyone deserves a chance, even the ones who might hurt you. It was about love that does not keep accounts. He paused, swallowing hard. I wasted 30 years running from that lesson. I built an empire on the foundation of your stolen dreams, and I told myself that success would justify everything. But success is hollow without meaning, and meaning is impossible without connection, and connection requires exactly the kind of vulnerability that I spent my whole life trying to avoid. He knelt down and placed his hand on the sun-warmed stone of the headstone. Your granddaughter found me, he said. She found me in my tower, surrounded by wealth and power and emptiness, and she delivered the message you left for me. Forgiveness. You forgave me, Hassan. After everything I did, after all the years of silence and abandonment, you forgave me, and that forgiveness has changed everything. Tears were streaming down his face now, falling onto the dusty ground of the cemetery. I cannot repay you. I know that. The debt I owe is beyond any calculation, but I can honor your memory. I can take the lesson you tried to teach me and live it every day. I can be the man you saw in that frightened boy eating garbage behind a restaurant, the man you believed I could become even when I had given you every reason to believe otherwise. He stood up, brushing the dust from his knees. I will take care of your family, he said. Fatima and Layla, they are my family now, too. I will make sure they never want for anything, not because I am buying forgiveness, but because that is what you would have done. That is what you did for me. He looked up at the sky, at the vast blue expanse that stretched from horizon to horizon. Thank you, Hassan. Thank you for saving my life twice. Once when you took me off the streets, and once when you sent your granddaughter to bring me home. He turned and walked back to where Fatima and Layla were waiting at the cemetery gate. Layla immediately took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his much larger ones, with the easy trust that only children possess. Did you talk to Grandpa? She asked. Yes, Khalid said. I told him that I am trying to be better, and I thanked him for sending you to find me. Layla nodded. He says you're welcome. He also says we should go get ice cream because it's really hot, and he knows a place nearby that has the best mango flavor in all of Egypt. Khalid looked at Fatima, who shrugged with a small smile. She's been having a lot of conversations with her grandfather lately, Fatima said. I have learned not to question them. Wise policy, Khalid agreed. He looked down at Layla. Lead the way, little one. If Hassan knows the best mango ice cream in Cairo, I am not going to argue. They walked out of the cemetery together, 3 people bound by a connection that defied logic and transcended time. A cleaning woman, a 6-year-old girl, and a billionaire who was learning, one day at a time, how to be human again. Behind them, in the shade of the date palms, Hassan's grave sat peaceful in the afternoon sun, and if anyone had been there to see, they might have noticed that the wind through the palm fronds sounded almost like laughter. The rest of the trip to Egypt was part pilgrimage and part vacation. They visited the pyramids, where Layla insisted on having her picture taken with every camel she encountered, and asked approximately 4,000 questions about mummies. They took a boat ride on the Nile, watching the sun set over the ancient river while Fatima told stories about her childhood in a small village in the delta. They ate at restaurants where the food tasted like memory, and the prices would have seemed like insults to Khalid a year ago, but now felt like gifts. And on their last day, they visited the neighborhood where Hassan had lived when he found a starving boy behind a restaurant. The house was still there, though it looked smaller than Khalid remembered, its walls weathered by decades of sun and sand. The current occupants, a young family with 3 children, were initially suspicious of the wealthy strangers at their door, but Fatima explained in Arabic that her father-in-law had once lived here, and they were welcomed in for tea with the warm hospitality that transcended economic circumstances. Khalid walked through the rooms where he had spent 3 years as Hassan's unofficial son. The layout was the same, though the furniture and decorations were different. He stood in the doorway of what had been his bedroom, a tiny space barely big enough for a mat and a small dresser, and remembered how it had felt like a palace after years on the streets. "This is where he taught me to read," he told Layla, who was exploring the house with her characteristic curiosity. "He would sit with me every night after dinner, going over letters and words, never losing patience no matter how many times I got confused." "Grandpa was a good teacher," Layla said. "He teaches me things in my dreams. Last week he taught me how to whistle with 2 fingers, but I can only do it when I'm dreaming." Khalid smiled. "He taught me that too. Here, let me show you." He demonstrated the technique, placing 2 fingers in his mouth and producing a sharp, clear whistle that echoed through the small house and made the young family's children giggle with delight. Layla tried to imitate him, producing something that was more spit than sound, but she refused to give up. Before they left, Khalid asked the family if he could see the backyard. They agreed, though they were clearly puzzled by the request. The yard was small and dusty, with a few scraggly plants struggling to survive in the harsh Egyptian sun. In one corner, there was a patch of disturbed earth where someone had been trying to grow vegetables. Khalid stood over that patch for a long moment, remembering a night 30 years ago when he had dug up a coffee can filled with dreams and possibilities, filled with money that represented 20 years of a good man's labor and hope. He had taken all of it, every penny, and he had never looked back. "This is where it was buried," he said quietly, speaking to no one in particular. "The money I stole. It was right here." Fatima came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "He never replanted anything in this spot," she said. "He told his wife that the soil was bad here, but I think the truth was that he could not bear to cover over the place where he had buried his dreams." Khalid closed his eyes against the sudden burn of tears. "How did he not hate me?" he asked. "How did he find it in his heart to forgive me, even after everything I took from him?" "And because hating you would have meant letting you steal something far more precious than money," Fatima replied. "It would have meant letting you steal his capacity for love, and that was something Hassan would never allow anyone to take." She squeezed his hand. "He used to say that the universe has a way of balancing things out, that what goes around comes around, even if it takes 30 years. He believed that one day, somehow, his faith in you would be rewarded." She looked at him with eyes that held both sorrow and hope. I think he would be very pleased to see that he was right. They left Cairo the next morning, flying back to New York on Khalid's private jet. Layla fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from a week of pyramids and ice cream and conversations with her grandfather's ghost. Fatima sat beside her, watching the little girl sleep with the protective tenderness of a grandmother who had already lost too much and could not bear to lose anything else. Khalid sat across from them, looking out the window at the clouds passing beneath the plane, thinking about everything that had happened since that rainy day in the conference room and everything that was still to come. He was different now. He could feel it in his bones, in the way he thought about problems, and the way he treated people, and the way he measured success. The old Khalid would have seen this year as a series of setbacks, money spent on workers who did not deserve it, time wasted on relationships that provided no strategic value, reputation risked on causes that had nothing to do with the bottom line. The new Khalid saw something else entirely. He saw redemption, messy and incomplete and ongoing. He saw growth, painful and necessary and ultimately joyful. He saw family, found in the most unexpected places and more precious than all the gold in all the vaults in all the world. And he saw purpose. Real purpose. Not the hollow ambition that had driven him for 30 years, but the deep, abiding sense that his life meant something beyond the numbers in his bank account. That he was here to do more than accumulate and consume. That he had been given a second chance by a man who should have cursed his memory, and he would spend the rest of his days trying to earn it. The plane began its descent into New York, the skyline emerging from the clouds like a forest of glass and steel. Somewhere down there was Al-Rashid Tower, 47 floors of the empire he had built on stolen dreams. Somewhere down there were 23,000 employees whose lives were being changed by decisions he was making every day. Somewhere down there was a future that was still being written, a story that was far from over. Layla stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about T-Rexes and ice cream. Fatima smiled and adjusted the blanket over her granddaughter's shoulders. Khalid watched them both, the cleaning woman's daughter and the cleaning woman who had become his conscience, and he felt something that had been foreign to him for most of his adult life. He felt content. Not the temporary satisfaction of closing a deal or crushing a competitor, not the fleeting pleasure of a new acquisition or a positive quarterly report, but real, deep, abiding contentment. The kind that came from knowing you were exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were supposed to do, surrounded by exactly the people you were supposed to love. The plane touched down at JFK, and they emerged into the familiar bustle of New York, the noise and energy and relentless forward motion that defined the city. A car was waiting to take them home, and as Khalid helped Layla into her car seat, she woke up just enough to give him a sleepy smile. "Mr. Khalid," she mumbled, "Grandpa says we did good." "Did he?" Khalid smiled back at her. "And what else did Grandpa say?" "He said the story isn't over yet. He said there's lots more fixing to do. But he said that's okay, because now you're not doing it alone." She fell back asleep before Khalid could respond, leaving him standing on the curb of the airport, blinking back tears, holding onto the words of a dead man delivered through the innocent mouth of a 6-year-old prophet. "You're not doing it alone." He wasn't. He never would be again. And that, more than all the billions of dollars in all the towers in all the cities of the world, was the greatest gift he had ever received. They drove through the Manhattan twilight toward home, toward dinner and laughter, and the slow, patient work of building a life that mattered. And in the gathering darkness of the car, surrounded by his unexpected family, Khalid al-Rashid finally understood what Hassan al-Farsi had known all along. Forgiveness was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning, and somewhere, in a cemetery in Cairo, under the shade of date palms that swayed in the evening breeze, a simple headstone stood watch over the grave of a man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. A man who had believed in a frightened boy and never stopped believing, even after that boy had stolen his dreams and disappeared into the world. A man whose love had reached across 30 years and an ocean and death itself to deliver 3 words that changed everything. "Grandpa forgives you." The wind rustled through the palms, carrying the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of the evening call to prayer. And if you listened very carefully, you might have heard something that sounded like a gentle laugh, the laugh of a man whose faith had finally been rewarded, whose legacy would live on in a little girl with his eyes and a billionaire with his second chance, whose story would continue to unfold in ways he could never have imagined, but had always somehow known. Love, after all, does not keep accounts. It simply gives, and trusts that the giving is enough. Khalid watched the city lights blur past the window and reached over to hold Fatima's hand, and together they drove home through the gathering night, carried forward by grace toward a future bright with possibility.